Hi, guys. I'm your host, Charlene, and welcome to today's episode, The Neurobiology and Significance. In today's day and age, it seems like everyone's in their own world with a growing lack of concern for others. That's why I've taken it upon myself to not only remind each other of the importance of empathy, but its roots in our biological evolution. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that this might be one of the more boring episodes of this season. However, it's important background knowledge to sort of explain what's to come. So, empathy is one of the very important pro-social behaviors that facilitates communication and understanding amongst individuals. It is often conflated with the term sympathy, however, it is not the same. It's actually the undercurrent to a number of emotional phenomena, ranging from feelings of concern for other people, which is sympathy, to actual motivation to help them and experiencing emotions that match other individuals' emotions. There are many different components to empathy. However, research has shown that there are 4 important components. The first is emotional or affective empathy, also known as emotional contingent, which is the ability to share the emotional states of others. The second equally significant component is cognitive empathy, which is the capacity to intentionally adopt other people's perspectives in order to fully understand their emotional and mental state. Cognitive empathy relies heavily on theory of mind, which is the capacity to infer the mental states of others, including things such as intentions and belief. The other 2 lesser-known components are sympathy and emotional regulation. Sympathy is characterized by concern, compassion, and strong motivation to improve others' well-being. Emotional regulation is just as it says, it's the ability to evaluate and control one's emotions in order to achieve an end goal. Now that we sort of figure out the different components that go into empathy, why do we have empathy in the first place? So it was originally evolved as a method of communication for emotions. Emotional contingent specifically, or affective empathy, evolved with a great number of social species and is fundamental for their survival, as it allows for social cohesion and coordination, especially in the face of danger and natural selection. Some species that are very similar to us, such as chimpanzees, have shown that when exposed to meaningful stimuli, they experience parallel physiological changes with humans. Additionally, it has been shown that caring for offspring is largely responsible for the development of empathy as a neural mechanism. We'll get into this more later when we talk about empathy development in infancy as well as childhood. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all of the areas that empathy utilizes in the brain, but it does utilize a number of areas, and I'm going to highlight a few here. It utilizes the anterior insula, the medial prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Additionally, it draws on a number of areas that are part of the limbic system. The limbic system is important in evaluation and regulation of emotion. If you want to know more about how these areas work together, as well as the research behind it, I wrote a paper on this topic, so there's lots of information there. It's important to note that lack of development or activity in these certain areas can lead to inhibited theory of mind, which is crucial to cognitive empathy. This has been shown in a number of neurodivergencies such as autism and psychopathy. Similarly, with people that have diseases that are neurodegenerative, such as dementia, Huntington's disease, and Alzheimer's. In a study comparing patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, it was found that participants with dementia displayed markedly lower levels of empathy. Outside of deterioration, lesions to these neural areas have also led to decreased empathy, most severely in cases of lesions to the ventral medial region and the right prefrontal cortex. And all the neuroscience majors that may or may not be listening to this was most, remarkably exemplified with Phineas Gage. He is a survivor of a pretty severe neural injury, and he essentially had an iron bar go through the greater part of the left frontal lobe of his brain and through his skull. He continued to survive after this. However, he was not the same, with a number of his personality traits being different, as well as decreases in a lot of things that would be normal, like neurobiological and neurosocial functioning. So, rest in peace him, but we learn about him every year. So he's a great example of this. Additionally, just to circle back to people with autism as well as psychopathy, they just generally have either, again, lack of activity in these areas, which is more aligned with psychopathy, or lack of development in these areas, which is more aligned with autism spectrum disorder. And within autism spectrum disorder, this has been correlated with alexithymia, which is challenges with feelings one's emotion, in which the greater lack of understanding the individual feels within their own emotion, the less activation of the anterior insula and overall empathizing within people that have autism spectrum disorder. So you might be wondering, how is empathy even measured? Like, how are all these studies talking about whether or not a person has more empathy? There are a number of different ways to measure empathy. However, the most popular method has been, one, taking MRI scans of the brain and seeing how these different areas that were highlighted in the paper and briefly highlighted in this podcast, how they respond to different stimuli. And then the interpersonal reactivity index is a subjective measure in which there are 4 different aspects of empathy and its relationship to social functioning that is measured. It is a 28-item self-report measure, and it has 4 7-item sub-measure, each of which measure one aspect of empathy. So overall, even though this was a very, very brief summary of 7 pages, maybe even 10 pages of my paper, I just want to make sure that this points out that empathy is a very crucial social behavior that emerged and grew from sort of just a survival mechanism and has continued to evolve. And now it starts from gestation and grows throughout adulthood. It has a very strong neurological basis, and it's very easily influenced by current and emerging social influences such as race, gender, social media, and artificial intelligence. So if any of those things intrigue you, the following episodes will be about how those different things have in the past influenced empathy and continue to influence empathy, as well as the future of how these things might influence empathy. So now let's welcome our guests.
My name is Richard Lewis, and I am a professor of psychological science and neuroscience at Pomona College.
Okay. So Professor Lewis is actually the department head of neuroscience. He's kind of playing it down a little bit, but he's going to get into a little bit of the neurobiology behind empathy and sort of how different areas of the brain work together to produce phenomenon such as empathy and other emotions. So,
wow, that's a big task.
it can be very general. It's for a very, general audience. So, yeah.
So one difficulty in answering your question is that people mean different things by empathy, right? And so my recollection is that someone said that they found 8 different uses of the word empathy in the literature. I think most of us think about empathy is feeling what someone else is feeling, but it can be simply being able to take someone else's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So cognitively understanding what someone else must be experiencing is kind of another way to think of empathy, as opposed to just feeling what people are feeling.
Right.
So there's an area of the brain, the temporal parietal junction, which is the area between the temporal lobe and parietal lobe, and that seems to play a special role in terms of perspective taking. So seeing things through someone else's eyes. And that is a very different area of the brain than if I was feeling empathic pain for your suffering or something. Because in that case, then if I'm displaying empathy at the fact that you're in pain, then the neurobiology of that is that what we call the pain matrix that will light up in your brain when you feel pain will be simulated in my brain. And so if I'm really feeling empathic then my pain matrix will become somewhat activated. And that would can include the somatosensory cortex, the insular cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, as well as some other areas like the periaqueductal gray. Mm-hmm. So depending on whether or not we're talking about feeling empathic pain versus kind of seeing things through your eyes or trying to come to some kind of understanding about what you must be experiencing in a situation, then we're going to have very different brain areas activated.
So basically what you're saying is that empathy isn't something that has its own sort of area like pain has the pain matrix. It's sort of something that piggybacked off of other areas in order for us to, I guess, evolve to be a better social species.
Right. So the people that study empathy will actually identify a whole lot of brain areas mm-hmm. that are involved. That it doesn't seem to be that there is one area of the brain that is the empathy center.
Right.
That depending on the nature of the situation, different brain areas are going to become activated. So if I'm experiencing the disgust that you're experiencing at some slimy thing or some moral infraction, it's going to be a different part of the brain that lights up as opposed to trying to put myself in your shoes or mm-hmm. feeling empathic pain.
So given that it draws on so many areas of the brain, how significant do you think empathy is?
I think it's kind of central to primate species, mm-hmm. that since we think that part of primate's success is being able to cooperate, then I think a key factor in that cooperation rests on empathy. And I think it's the kind of connection that we can experience for each mm-hmm. other that is a key component of being able to cooperate. So for whatever reason, we seem to want people to understand what we're going through and experiencing, and being able to understand how I look at things or how I react to things or how I'm feeling. And that's, I think, at the core of what we mean when we say empathy. So I think it's a critical factor in terms of the evolution of primates that allows us to connect with each other in a way that we feel bonds and commitment and obligation and things like that, mm-hmm. as well as really just, following moral codes.
Right.
A central aspect of morality
mm-hmm.
is, that we want people to treat us like we want to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is kind of the basis of that. So many people have speculated that sort of the development of empathy among primates can rest back to the mother-infant bonds mm-hmm. that exist, and the bonds that, by analogy, right, that if we build on that so that we extend that to other people, mm-hmm. then it's the same kind of connection, and that leads us to care for each other, for example.
So I'm going to slightly go on a tangent, but I'm currently in a class with Professor Lewis about free will, and we're going to talk about it just because I was thinking about it. But essentially, because empathy is something that's sort of like, obviously there's reasons for empathy developing, but like, would you say like the first person to ever, or the first primate, I guess, or Homo sapien or whatever, to ever like display empathic behavior or like altruistic behavior, because that's sort of even further from like, because there's no real like true altruism doesn't really have any benefit to the person. So would you say that might be like an example of like a random evolutionary like development that might not necessarily benefit the person?
Can you say that one more time?
Yes. Okay, so empathy, like the first primates to ever display empathy, would that be an example of like free will? No?
I would have to take the position no.
Why? You're gonna explain a little bit.
That if let's say there was some change in our brains such that now for the first time, if you're in pain, that I feel that, then my reaction to that could be very automatic, right? I might react in the same way as I would if I'm in pain. So I might try to stop the bleeding or something. And we assume that part of empathic pain is that it causes me to take care of you if you are injured, because I know how I would feel in that situation. And so the pain signals that you send cause me to do something pro-social for you. And then you can argue about whether that's altruism, right?
Yeah.
I think, in the way I think about altruism, I would say, yes, that there's no sort of obvious benefit to me helping you, possibly, and causing some threat to myself. If something happened to you, happened to me. There's some risk, there's some energy that I'm utilizing to take care of you. So I would count that as altruism. But one could counter that and say, yeah, but I'm just reducing my own pain, right?
Yeah.
By helping you. I'm just making myself feel better. So maybe we say that's not altruistic. But I don't know if that, in either case, that would be free will.
Do you think altruism, like true altruism, exists or no?
I would probably kind of sound like a lot of compatibilists who kind of change the definition of free will, but they can retain it at some level. And so I think of altruism in terms of just if I'm doing something without any immediate benefit, if I'm sacrificing something, time, energy, some effort, and there isn't an obvious benefit to me, then I count that as altruism. Otherwise, I think with humans, we could always make the argument that it reduces some aversive feeling I have, and therefore it doesn't count as altruism. But then altruism never exists, and so we throw it out. That's a this concept.
Okay, so I'm gonna, come back a little bit. Another question I had was, have you ever interacted with people with dementia? Because in the literature review, I talk about like damage or deterioration in certain areas, or like lack of development in certain areas can lead to a lack of display of empathy. So in terms of like people with dementia, Alzheimer's, autism, or even certain mental health disorders, like have you ever interacted with those people, and like do you see that they display a lack of empathy in their maybe like conversation or their actions, behavior?
That's a really good question. I have worked with people with dementia, but I can't think of a situation where I noticed that they were not empathic. In my experience, most people who have dementia respond quite normally at a kind of visceral, emotional level. But it's going to depend in part on the type of dementia. And if it's frontotemporal dementia, for example, then the behavior might be completely inappropriate. Very impulsive, saying things that, maybe
Have
they
you heard
shouldn't
about
have said.
Wendy Williams?
Sorry?
Wendy Williams? She has frontotemporal dementia and aphasia and something else, I think Graves' disease. And they're doing like a documentary on her now. She I don't even know what happened, but she left her show and then was out of the media for like maybe a year or two, and then they recently put out a documentary about her and what she's going through, and it's so sad. Even though she was obviously like a mean person on her show, it's still really sad, But yeah, I don't know if you've seen that.
But I can't think of a patient I've seen in recent years. My patient contact is
Yeah.
not non-existent at all. But I can't think of any cases of that. I mean, the obvious example of people who don't display empathy would be psychopaths.
Yeah. Have you met any? No.
Well, you meet a lot of people with kind of
Like psychopathic
tendencies. Yeah. And I did see case conferences when I was a postdoc of psychopaths. It's fascinating because it's just, you have someone without that characteristic and they just seem to behave in a way that is antithetical to what we expect in terms of humans. And I think that's part of our fascination with serial killers, right? Is that it's just so hard, to imagine the kinds of things that they do without any remorse, guilt whatsoever.
I'm just wondering, well, this is sort of relates to something that I had seen on TikTok about this lady. Her name was Risa Tisa, and she had it was like a 50-part, 500-minute series where she talked about how she married a man. The series is called Who the F Did I Marry? And she married a man after about 2 years. This was during COVID. So she was, I guess, the circumstances as well as her age sort of pressure her into thinking she should settle to marry with this man. But he was already showing signs of like lying initially. And I watched this whole series this past weekend. So I'm just, anyway. But he was a pathological liar, and he like lied about almost everything. And he would like get up every morning and like have phone calls with himself. He lied about how many siblings he's had, like where he went to college and like things like that. But essentially all this background was to ask Professor Lewis whether he thinks people with those sort of issues who I guess may or may not go out of their way to manipulate people, like, I don't know, pathological liars maybe, like narcissists maybe, but it's also like a mental health issue, like it's, there's something going on. Do you think that those people display lack of empathic traits, or have you interacted with anyone with those diagnoses? They display those traits?
I don't have an expert opinion on that, but my guess is yes, that they would lack that empathy, because I think, especially in the situation you described, where there's a spouse, there's a commitment, and if you're not able to take the perspective of the other person and how they would feel if they found out, that you had made up everything, that you were lying all the time, that your background wasn't true, what you did this morning wasn't real. I think it's hard to imagine people doing that and living with empathic guilt or something.
Yeah, that's true.
It seems hard to imagine. And I think that I'd mentioned earlier that a lot of people kind of place it at the core of morality, because it does seem that one of the breaks that we have on taking advantage of everyone else is this, understanding of how it would feel if that were you. And again, getting back to treating people as you would like to be treated seems to be kind of a core issue in morality. Otherwise, why wouldn't we just take advantage of everyone for self? Only when we, understand how it feels and not thinking it's right for someone else to treat me that way, do we treat each other. If you think about all the interactions that are happening all the time and how few result in someone taking advantage of someone else, stealing, aggression, manipulation, manipulation. Something's got to be stopping us from doing those kinds of things.
Right.
When on the surface, it could be quite easy to take advantage of people. We don't, by and large, I don't know what percentage of the time we do take advantage of others, but it's quite small given all of the opportunities that we have.
I feel like a lot of the stuff that I researched didn't talk about as much how people with other mental health disorders might display lack of empathy. Much of the emphasis was on psychopaths, like you talked about. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the different DSM-5, I don't know, is that what they use, or do they use something else now? They use something else now, right?
It probably is DSM-5 revised or something. And then there's, outside the United States, there's an international criteria. Something.
But a lot of those, I guess, outlines criteria for different things, a lot of them actually overlap. You can have certain traits for one mental health disorder and then the same traits for another one, or one or two, that overlap. So I feel like maybe that's where it comes from. I just wonder if there's maybe we'll find out one day later on down the line that there's maybe one specific brain area, because the prefrontal cortex does a lot of the whole sort of inhibiting things and rationalization. So I wonder if there's further on down the line we'll find out that people that have those sort of mental health disorders, maybe they all share one sort of, I don't know, maybe damage or gene or something that affects that area. Because I feel like that's a super important area in terms of that.
Yeah. So borderline personality is going to have some manipulative components to it, mm-hmm. just like psychopathy. Mm-hmm. Antisocial behavior is going to have this disregard of societal rules, just like psychopathy. So there are these kind of different dimensions mm-hmm. of psychopathy that, yes, I think map on to others, and so you have these probably different clusters of those features.
Yeah, exactly.
That then they're going to manifest themselves, in one disorder versus another.
Okay. Over time, with interacting with different generations of students, have you seen any changes over time with empathy among students? Because, in the past, there wasn't as much social media and things like that. And I know with social media and media becoming such a big part of growing up, we're exposed to a lot more violence and random things on the internet. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any do you think you've seen changes amongst generations of students?
It's an interesting question, and obviously I don't have data on such things, but and I think it's probably hard to know if it really is a difference in empathy. I do think among students there's a greater sense of being sensitive to other people than in the past. It's kind of one of the features of modern day academia, right? That as we're trying to be more equitable, as we're trying to be more inclusive, raising sensitivity about how it feels when you say something to someone else and interact with someone, and being more sensitive to body shaming, and being more sensitive to assumptions about income, and just so that is different. And I think there's something real. I don't mm-hmm. know if that translates into more empathy, but it probably, at least in some cases, does. When someone becomes aware, I didn't realize that was offensive, then that sensitivity probably changes the way that we feel in the future when you hear someone say that again, or you see someone treated in that kind of way. So I think that's a big change and a positive change. But I don't know if people feel more or less.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think what we've seen in the United States and across the globe is this, I'll call it interesting change in polarization in terms of real extreme views, and the ones that have impressed me are those extreme individualistic, right? Where there's less empathy for other people.
Yeah.
Especially if they're defined as other. They're defined as outgroup. And that's horrifying change that has happened over decades. And that's going to change, obviously, the way people empathize or not.
Yeah.
With others. And so there is, I think, but that's probably more of a function of othering people then allows us not to feel empathy anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That they're not fully human. They're deserving of their terrible fate. They deserve to be destroyed because they're horrible. So they probably still have the same capacity for empathy, but they've really pulled it in.
Right.
And restricted it to a much smaller group.
I have multiple questions that I was thinking of. You talked about individualistic societies. America is actually a very individualistic society. Have you you're going to China, which is cool. Have you traveled to any other societies and seen more of a community-based society in comparison? Do you think they're all individualistic, or
no? They're all more
community-based.
More community-based.
Do you think so? I'm trying to think of where I've been to. I don't know if they all are. I don't know.
Australia's supposed to be equal to the United States in terms of
really.
Independence.
I think I went to France actually for my cousin's wedding this past summer. I think they're probably more individualistic than Americans, but maybe that's just my.
And what did you observe?
It was because I feel I'm very I try to be very socially aware, and if somebody needs help, I'll help them. But I literally as soon as I got to the airport, somebody broke a glass, and I went over to help her, and I don't speak French, so I was just I'm gonna try and help you. And then I was okay, I'm gonna go get the attendant lady to try and help you. But nobody else in the airport seemed to care, and then not even the attendant lady seemed to care, and I was that doesn't make any sense. Even if you don't really care, this is your job, and she was kind of rude about it because, well, I'm an American. I know French people don't like Americans, but I was okay, even if you don't like me as an American, you could help your fellow countrymen out. I don't know, but I think that I don't know where else. My mom's from St. Lucia, so I feel in St. Lucia they're more community-based for sure. That's a small Caribbean island, so that's yeah. But do you think that France a capitalist?
You're asking the wrong person. But there's a history in even Western Europe, of a social welfare state, right? The idea that the state is to provide all the support and services, and there's been a lot of pushback on that through various political changes, but we see that much more in Europe than we do in the United States.
Yeah.
Where, for example, there was a big uproar because the president wanted to increase the retirement age.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I heard about that.
From, what was it?
I think it was 60 something, or 65. Yeah.
And because people expect their pension, expect to live a good life, and expect that society will provide for them. Healthcare in most of those European countries is not based on insurance and ability to pay, and so there's a very different kind of value system in terms of taking care of each other at some level. That we expect the government to do that, but within that, you can sometimes get countries where there is that collective value, but it's a constraint on some very individualistic behavior. So in Denmark, for example, it's also a social welfare state, but there's a movement to resist that and push back against that. But they're known for being very independent, but there's a societal value that probably constrains their independence in some kind of way. For example, no one crosses the street if there's a red light. Like everyone comes to a halt and waits. And there's this kind of, yeah, it's so different from the United States where people take off. And it's this very organized kind of thing. But I'd heard about this kind of strong independence within that kind of constraint. And I saw it a couple of times where if you're walking down the street, you may just like push someone out of the way.
Oh, wow. I'm so...
And I'd heard about that and then I saw it.
Oh, wow.
Like, wow, that's what they're talking about.
I was going to ask if you think that the shift towards like more, because obviously globalization has become more prominent over time. However, there is a shift towards more individualism. And I was wondering if you think that relates back to like economic systems, like for example, the US is a very capitalistic society compared to like, I don't know, is Canada socialism still or no?
Much more so than the United States, yeah.
So like, yeah.
Free
Yeah.
healthcare, gun laws,
Yeah.
things to protect the whole.
Yeah. So would you say that maybe the lack of empathy is also just related to the general like socioeconomic state of the country that a person lives in, or is it just more of a general trend amongst the world?
That's a good question. One of the ways that people understand individualism and collectivism is based on economics. And so you get these people from Western Europe largely who decided to come to the United States. These are people who wanted to leave their communities, right? That's probably a different person than those who stay behind. And then when you have this westward expansion, right, you're getting people going out on their own, living on their own, taking care of their immediate family, and consequently, I think you have these strong individualist values that was really just selection bias. The people who decided to leave, people who decided to move west, and people have tried to track slight differences in genetic makeup versus those who are kind of like the wheat agriculture where one can do that on their own. Whereas in rice cultures like East Asia, where a tremendous amount of cooperation is needed to harvest the rice, then we're much more collectivistic societies, and to the extent that they're vulnerable to enemies requires adherence to community norms. So there are all these kinds of geopolitical, economic factors that some people have tried to explain those differences in independence and collectivism.
Okay. Well, I think that's all. I think that's it. Yeah. Do you have any, concluding statements about empathy or anything you would like to say?
I'm a big fan.
Of the podcast? Of empathy?
Of now the podcast. Empathy. I think we could all use a little bit more.
I agree.
Empathy. We think about people unlike ourselves.
Yeah.
We seem to be missing that in today's world.
I think honestly though, like that's really just a symptom of like a lot of economics, honestly. Like social media, even like your For You page. Everything is catered for you. Or like work, even though you might work in a group setting, a lot of work nowadays is about what you can produce as an individual. It's not like farming, like et cetera, et cetera. It's about how you excel. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think the way I think of it, from those core individualistic values, we believe that that's the way it should be. And consequently, it manifests itself in everything that we do. So competition. And we don't really emphasize enough or value enough the importance of facilitating others.
Yeah.
That's another way to think about work.
Yeah.
Who are the people who facilitate the work of others versus just look at it as I'm competing against everything else.
Exactly. I think we're going to wrap things up. As a final question, the remaining episodes will talk about empathy development, like throughout childhood, adolescence, adulthood, late adulthood, and then how gender influences empathy, how race influences empathy, and then how social media and AI come into like interaction with empathy. Do you have any comments on any of those? You don't have to do all of them. Any of them.
I can recommend some good people.
Okay. But do you have any comments on this the topic specifically or no?
Not exactly. I think gender is really interesting because of the gender differences that exist.
Okay.
And one could imagine how that could be an extension of whatever goes into mothers caring for children. It's easy to kind of see how that characteristic, which is so important for survival of the species, then could be generalized to others as well. But we also see, for every biological explanation, we see certainly the ways that society also structures that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Lewis.
All right. Well, good luck.
So I think Professor Lewis touched on a number of really important things, but most importantly, we talked about individualism and like economic systems, just a bunch of things. However, I think that, like I said in the beginning of this episode, in the beginning of this series, I think individualism is a growing concern. And I think that this really touches back on our economic systems and the different things that are being pushed within our economic systems. So social media being part of that, but also like the newer developments such as artificial intelligence and things like that, which we'll talk about later on in the artificial intelligence episode. But all those things are being catered towards an individual. And I think that it's important to reflect upon how much of society is catered towards individualism in America. Even just like the things that we eat, the things that we like literally consume, like media, and then like other things that we actually consume. And even like I saw a TikTok the other day about like the lack of third spaces that we have as like a society, and like third spaces being like you have work, you have home, but a third space being another place that you can like go outside of your home and seek solace, which is a community-based space. And those are more so common in European countries and other countries that are more collectivism-based. So just thinking about those things like in our day-to-day interactions that push us towards individualism, and then actively going against that, and thinking of ways that we can be more involved in other people's lives, be more involved in our communities, and have more empathy for each other. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode, and I hope you listen to the rest.